It's no secret that a lot of the hype behind little green pedals like these is because of John Mayer and his use of tube screamers and other overdrives. On today's episode, I'm going to be going over the whole timeline on John Mayer's overdrive use, starting with Any Given Thursday and Room from Squares, leading all the way up into the 2019 World Tour and the Dead & Company shows. So sit back, relax, and let's get right into it. So in order to start the timeline off, we have to go way back to 2001 and Room for Squares. John's main overdrive during this period was a TS9DX. He also did mess around with the Fulltone Full Drive 2 MOSFET edition. There is a rumor that he did start using a King of Tone version 2 around this time, but we have no pictures or evidence to confirm otherwise. Now, Any Given Thursday is quite the live performance that John did, his first real big one that was filmed and documented, and a lot of people consider the Cover in the Rain performance a holy grail tone for John, and it's funny because he wasn't using that crazy gear, he wasn't using stuff that's unobtainium like dumbbells and vintage strats and stuff like that during that performance. So John's main overdrive during Any Given Thursday was again a TS9DX. He has what appears to be a Menatone red snapper overdrive. We're not entirely sure if that's the case because unfortunately, as we're this far back, a lot of the pictures are blurry and there's just not that much information that's known. But a TS9DX into a clean amp, that's going to be your overdrive tone that you want. Now, as we move along into the Heavier Things tour, John started using a Marshall Bluesbreaker, the MK1 edition. He still kept using that Fulltone Full Drive 2 as well and kind of mixed, and it did have both of those on a board at one point. We also know that this is where John first started using that vintage TS808 that really started off the modern tube screamer use for him and his tone. Now, right after Heavier Things, that era ended, we move on into the John Mayer Trio. Now, this is considered the pinnacle of John's playing and tone for a lot of people. Myself, it's one of my favorite eras as well. Now, John went and stuck with that vintage TS808 as well as a Keeley modded Boss Blues Driver BD2. That was famously used as a light overdrive, the TS being his main tone. He also did experiment with the Keeley modded 808 as well, and that he has gone on to mention that if you can't afford or can't find a vintage 808, the Keeley modded 808 does contain a lot of the same mojo that the vintage one has and is a great option if you can find one of those modded ones as well. Now, of course, the John Mayer Trio is heavily credited with being the foundation of John's most famous and successful album, Continuum. During Continuum, we know that the John Mayer Trio pedal board served as the foundation of his tones in the studio, but there were tables and tables full of pedals that he was using, so it's rather impossible to know exactly what he was using. We do have some shots of him using the King of Tone V2 in the studio during the Continuum recording. Whether or not that actually made it on the album, we don't know. There was also tables full of way huge pedals, a custom shop Fulltone Full Drive 2, and numerous other overdrives, so it's really impossible to know for sure. It's highly speculated as well that the Marshall Bluesbreaker Mark I made it onto the recording of Continuum because not long after the Continuum recording ended and the tour started, that pedal was in the rack for sure. We also know that on March 1st, 2007 was the very first time John used, again, the most famous pedal probably that he's known for using, the Ibanez TS10. We know that Rene Martinez actually gave John a couple of Stevie Ray Vaughan's own TS10 pedals, maybe that's what sparked his use of that pedal, but from then on, the TS10 became his main overdrive that he used. Also in the rack, there are times where it's shown that the Boss BD2 was actually in there as well. Now, he was probably using that and mixing around and playing with those tones versus the Bluesbreaker as a light overdrive, and then still focusing on the TS10 as his main overdrive use. And of course, we can't talk about Continuum without talking about John's most famous live performance, Where the Light Is. Now, of course, as there's no picture of John's rack for that actual show, it's impossible to know with 100% certainty what he used during that performance. But, of course, it's very easy to assume and safe to assume that he used a TS10 as well as the Bluesbreaker Mark I. Now, as I mentioned, there were pictures of a Boss BD2 in the rack, and I like to think that John stuck with staying true to some of the trio tones during that show and used it as well, because we do know that there was a slot on that Custom Audio Electronics rack for a third overdrive. So let's just say for Where the Light Is, it was a TS10, a Mark I Bluesbreaker, as well as a Boss BD2, most likely. That makes the most sense. And of course, after Where the Light Is, we move on into the Battle Studies era. Now, the Battle Studies era is where John started using the Klon, and a lot of people think that he used it actually earlier than he did, but during the 2009 era is where you really see the Klon come out and John start to favor it over that Mark I Bluesbreaker.
How's all of the pedals that he wants to use, and they're always on, they're never off. If they're off, then they won't be employed. So as you can see, all the red lights indicating that the power is on, is there.
Then in 2012, 2013, 2014, we are talking about the Born and Raised and Paradise Valley era. Now this era, John kind of interestingly mixed around with his tube screamer of choice. Some shows he used the TS10, other shows he went back to that vintage 808. Who knows what he was thinking? Maybe he just wanted to, think back to those tones he had and test out the 808 against the TS10 and see what he preferred. But we know that he has stuck since then with the TS10 as his main tube screamer. Now, of course, the Klon ended up kicking the Blues Breaker off John's board completely, and he favored the Klon for his light source of overdrive. Now, of course, as the Born and Raised in Paradise Valley era concludes, we move on to the Search for Everything era, which has the last studio album from John that we've heard even this far now into 2021. During the Search for Everything World Tour, John brought out the biggest pedal board we've ever seen from him. It was two boards side by side with that custom audio electronic switcher in the middle. Now, John's main two overdrives again were the Klon and the TS10. He really did though start to experiment with a third overdrive, and some pedals he experimented with during that time were the Way Huge Camel Toe, the Dunlop version, the Mark II, as well as the Shin's Music Dumble Lloyd Twin. Now both of those pedals were kind of on and off and he experimented. There were some other honorable mentions that he did use, but those were kind of some of the main ones that he experimented with that pedal board during that era. Now of course in the late 2010s, John did also start playing with the Deaden Company. His main pedal board was still the Search for Everything World Tour pedal board, but he just had the custom audio electronic switcher in front of him. The two boards were actually in a rack unit behind his gear. Now during this time, he actually did start to experiment with this pedal right here, the Mesa Boogie Flux 5. A lot of people think he started using that in the second leg of the 2019 World Tour, but actually in 2017 is where he first started experimenting with this pedal, and we got a couple pictures to prove it. Now, the 2019 World Tour is pretty much our last stop on the timeline for John's overdrive use. Now, during the first leg of the 2019 World Tour, we did see John experiment with a few different overdrives. He had the Hermidia Audio Zen Drive 2 on his pedal board, as well as the Blackstone Appliances MOSFET overdrive like the one I have here. He also had the Smoky Signal tubeless overdrive on his board. So overall, the first leg of the tour had quite a few overdrives on it. Now moving into the second leg of the tour, which was North America, John ditched most of the overdrives in favor of a 3 overdrive setup. That was the Klon, the TS10, and again, the Mesa Boogie Flux 5. Now the Klon, however, was that mysterious black Klon. Again, we do know that that's a real Klon. The question is how much of it was modded, or if it was modded at all. It's a big mystery, but it's a Klon nonetheless. Now during the third part and the last leg of the 2019 World Tour, John did experiment with the Dumble Lloyd again, as well as using the Solo Dallas Storm. Now that's kind of a boost pedal, can get into a little bit of overdrivey flavor, so I'm including it in this timeline. And there you guys have it. That pretty much concludes John's overdrive history. There are a few honorable mentions that I did want to discuss though before we conclude the timeline. Back in 2008, 2009, maybe a little into late 2007, John was using the Zen Drive 1, the original one from Hermidia Audio, as well as the Smoky Signal started to make a few appearances in his rack and on some pedal boards. Now, the use wasn't quite totally known. It seems like John just had gotten those pedals around that time and just was throwing them on his board and experimenting. They were never major players in his tone during those eras, but it's important to note that he did use them for a couple shows and the odd time around that timeline. Of course, another honorable mention being the King of Tone V2 again was famously used with Barbra Streisand in 2014. That's a really cool pedal, but again, not something that's really credited for being a key cornerstone of John's overdrive tone. And of course, we also have the Chase Bliss Condor. That was used for one show during the 2019 World Tour. And we also have the JHS Bonsai, being a pedal that John has used during Instagram Lives, as well as he used it with Shawn Mendes live actually. So if you're looking for a really good Tube Screamer clone and something that's a bit more affordable, John has used the JHS Bonsai and it was good enough for him, so that is easily good enough for any of us as well. And that concludes the full timeline of John's overdrive history. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and you learned something. If you did, please give the video a thumbs up. That really helps the channel grow and spread the knowledge to more people. As well, about 90% of you guys who watch my videos aren't subscribed yet, so come on. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, do all that good YouTube stuff, and new videos will be out every Sunday. So until the next one, you guys, take care. Thanks for watching.